a little bit about like how the meaning of neutrality has changed over time in recent history and kind of what it means today?
Sure. I mean, I suppose for me, I think there's one big shift. Before 1945, I would argue that you had maybe a narrower definition of neutrality in terms of non-belligerence in war and non-membership of peacetime of military alliances in peacetime. And I think since 1945, if you look at the European neutral states, they've developed an expanded definition of neutrality which brings in things like support for multilateral institutions, support for conflict resolution, nuclear disarmament and so on. So for me, I think that in historic terms was a big shift in terms of a broadening of the concept of neutrality.
Great. And do you think that changing definition opens up more opportunities, or there's kind of ways that this new sort of conceptualization of the term could kind of bring benefits to the global system or to individual countries that could...
I mean, I suppose in big picture terms, the way I think about it is that it means that in a new context, post-Cold War, post-9/11, rise of China and so on, that the neutral states can still play a constructive role. So in terms of supporting many of those things, multilateral institutions, the UN, conflict resolution, to some extent standing against populism, standing against nationalism, I suppose, those are things where the neutral countries have a certain voice and a certain perspective, which I would argue is, if you like, a constructive contribution. So I think they can provide an element of leadership around some of those kinds of issues. And the other thing I think I would say is that some of that they do nationally, so sort of independently as individual countries, but also they leverage it through working through institutions like the EU, like the UN, like the OSCE. So I think, you know, one of the things that comes across is, if you like, the compatibility of neutrality with multilateral institutions.
And then do you think in the future, if you were to speculate, do you think that there's expanding room for kind of neutrality being leveraged, or other countries also moving towards neutrality, or do you think decreasing space? Do you have kind of a sense of what the future
I mean, I think, and we've seen this at this conference in the past 2 days, there's clearly a debate about whether neutrality may be an option for particularly some of the now in-between countries between the enlarged NATO and EU on the one hand and Russia on the other hand. Right now, if you look at somewhere like Ukraine or Georgia, there doesn't seem to be much support for neutrality, but I think it's on the table there as a possibility for those countries, and there are reasons to think that it might be a better option for them than joining NATO, or alternatively, perhaps if they end up never being able to join NATO, then would neutrality be a better choice potentially for Ukraine, Georgia, and maybe other former Soviet countries. So I think, you know, it's there. And also, again, at this conference, we've had a little bit of discussion around kind of global great power relations. So are there other situations where you might find countries, as it were, squeezed between big powers where neutrality might be an option? And Taiwan has been one of the countries that's been mentioned in that context. So at minimum, I think the idea of neutrality doesn't go away, and it may be a constructive, interesting, useful option for certain countries, particularly countries that maybe find themselves, as it were, squeezed between the great powers in an era of maybe intensifying great power competition.